Today, more than 8 billion humans live on Earth. We are everywhere. Cities bustling with neon lights, farms stretching across fertile plains, villages clinging to mountain slopes, and people carving out lives in deserts where little else survives. Humanity has built skyscrapers taller than ancient mountains, launched rockets that touch the edge of space, and created an invisible web of communication, the internet, that binds billions of us together. No other species has dominated the planet in quite this way. But if you could turn back time, far back, about 900,000 years ago, you would find a very different picture. The Earth was harsher, less forgiving, and humanity's presence was almost invisible. In fact, our entire species balanced on the edge of extinction. At that time, there were not millions, not even hundreds of thousands of humans. There were barely 1,280 breeding individuals left alive across the entire planet. That number is smaller than the number of students in a large high school. Imagine that. The fate of every future human, every city, every song, every invention rested on fewer people than it takes to fill a small sports arena. It is difficult to believe we're here at all. Our lineage survived when it should not have. For more than 100,000 years, those survivors endured in scattered groups, hanging on by a thread so thin it's almost impossible to comprehend. The odds were stacked against them. At such small population sizes, extinction is not only likely, it's expected. And yet, against the silence of an unforgiving world, they lived. Here's what makes this story even stranger. Until very recently, no one knew this had ever happened. For decades, scientists puzzled over an unusual mystery in our DNA. Humans, despite our enormous population, are surprisingly alike on the genetic level. Chimpanzees, who live in scattered family groups across Africa, have far more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans combined. That shouldn't be possible, unless something terrible had once reduced our numbers so drastically that nearly all genetic variation was wiped away. That something is what scientists call a genetic bottleneck, a catastrophic collapse in population size, and the signs of it were hiding in our chromosomes like a forgotten memory. The discovery came not from digging up fossils, but from examining living people. In 2018, a researcher named Wang Jie and colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences began analyzing the DNA of more than 3,000 people worldwide. They were using a kind of molecular clock, tracking mutations backwards through time, following the trail of genetic changes that accumulate slowly, generation after generation. And then, in the data, a signal emerged. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic record collapsed. It was as if 99% of the actors in the play of human history suddenly walked off stage, leaving only a handful behind. The models insisted something catastrophic had occurred. At first, the scientists thought it must be a glitch. The numbers were too extreme. But no matter how many times they repeated the calculations, using new methods and different assumptions, the story stayed the same. Nearly 99% of our ancestors were wiped out. For the next 117,000 years, the survivors clung to existence. Small, fragile, yet unbroken. How do we know any of this? Not from a single bone or an ancient campfire, but from the quiet ledger inside us, DNA. A team led by Wang Jiehu and colleagues assembled genomes from 3,154 living people and used a new computational approach called FitCol to wind the molecular clock backward. As they pushed through time, the curve suddenly plunged. Their best-fitting model said our ancestors fell to an effective breeding population of roughly 1,280 individuals between about 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, a decline of about 98.7% that lasted around 117,000 years. Again and again, with different checks, the signal remained. The numbers were unnerving, but they held. If you're listening in the dark, think of it like this. Imagine tracing a slow, steady heartbeat on a monitor, and then, without warning, it flattens, a long, low line that barely rises for an age. That flat line isn't death. It's the signature of a bottleneck, when a once broad river of ancestry narrows to a trickle. In small populations, chance looms large. Harmful mutations can build up. Random disasters can erase entire lineages. Biologists even have a phrase for the spiral that can follow. The extinction vortex, a feedback loop where low numbers, inbreeding, and environmental stress feed each other, accelerating decline. Most species that enter it never return. Ours did, somehow. But why then? The timing places our crisis within the early Middle Pleistocene transition, the era when Earth's ice age rhythm changed tempo. Before this shift, glacial cycles pulsed every about 41,000 years. After, they stretched to longer, harsher, about 100,000-year swings. Ice sheets grew fatter, sea levels fell, temperatures and rainfall patterns lurched. In Africa, that likely meant a long choreography of drought and fragmentation, woodlands thinning to grassland, grassland to dust. For creatures like us, big-brained, slow-breeding generalists, such instability can be ruinous. There's another clue outside of genes: the fossil gap. Between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, the African and Eurasian record of human ancestors looks strangely sparse. For decades, the emptiness was a riddle: bad luck in discovery, or fewer people to leave remains. The genetic bottleneck gives a sobering answer. When so few bands wander a continent, the odds that any die in just the right sediment, with just the right chemistry to fossilize, and then that we find them, plunge toward zero. The silence of stone echoes the whisper in our DNA. And yet tonight's story is not about vanishing. It's about endurance. An effective population size of about 1,280 doesn't mean exactly that number of bodies on Earth, but it does represent how many were successfully breeding and passing genes forward. It implies a metapopulation, small groups scattered, connected now and then by movement and marriage, each one vulnerable, but the network just barely resilient. In such a world, cooperation isn't virtue, it is oxygen. Humans today carry the consequences. Our genetic diversity is oddly low for a species so numerous. 2 chimpanzees chosen at random may differ more at the DNA level than 2 humans from distant continents. Reduced variation can leave us more uniformly exposed to certain diseases, but it also testifies to the cliff we once dangled from and the long, careful climb back. As you breathe and drift, remember, your heartbeat carries the rhythm of a population that refused to stop. Picture yourself, not as a modern human with cities and electricity, but as an early ancestor 900,000 years ago. The air is dry. What was once forest has thinned into scrubland, and the scrub has surrendered to sand. Waterholes vanish one by one. Rivers shrink into cracked riverbeds. The herds your people depended on, elephants, antelope, zebras, begin to dwindle. Plants that once fed whole families wither before they can bear fruit. This wasn't just a drought. It was the new normal, sculpted by the rhythms of Earth's changing orbit and the expansion of ice sheets far to the north. The early Middle Pleistocene transition, was no gentle shift. Before it, glaciers waxed and waned in manageable about 41,000-year cycles. Afterward, ice ages deepened into brutal about 100,000-year winters, each locking more water into frozen sheets. Sea levels fell by hundreds of feet. Weather systems bent and broke. Africa, the cradle of humankind, became a patchwork of deserts and sparse grasslands. The continent that had nurtured life for millions of years now forced species to choose: adapt, migrate, or vanish. Most vanished. Fossil evidence tells us that many large mammals did not survive this age of aridification. Antelope species that had endured for millennia suddenly disappear from the record. Elephant populations shrank, and predators that relied on them starved in turn. For early humans, survival meant radical flexibility. You ate whatever you could: insects, roots, eggs, small animals. You followed faint hints of water, maybe a stand of green trees, maybe the flight of birds circling where springs still bubbled. You lived not by abundance, but by scraps. And yet, a tiny handful of human groups endured. Perhaps they found rare refuges: valleys where groundwater rose, highlands where mist condensed, rift zones where rainfall lingered. These hidden places may have been the only islands of stability in a continent gone dry. Some researchers suggest that the Great Lakes of East Africa or long-flowing rivers could have sheltered them. Others imagine smaller oases, pockets of greenery scattered across an otherwise hostile land. Wherever they were, those enclaves preserved the thread of our lineage while countless others snapped. What kept them alive wasn't only luck, it was fire. Evidence suggests that around 800,000 years ago, use of fire became more widespread. Fire meant cooked meat, easier to chew and safer to eat. Fire meant roots and tubers, once toxic, now edible. It meant warmth through long, cold nights, protection against prowling predators, and hours of light for storytelling, teaching, repairing tools. Fire turned nights into classrooms, where skills and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. It was not just a tool, it was survival's companion. A fragile flame echoing the fragile flame of humanity itself. Imagine the circle of light. A dozen tired faces illuminated against the darkness. Beyond the fire, silence. The endless night. The predators. The unknown. Within the fire's glow, warmth and the sound of voices. Plans for tomorrow. Warnings about dangers, perhaps even the beginnings of myth. Against overwhelming odds, our ancestors didn't just endure. They learned. They shared. They kept the flame alive. Survival during those 117,000 years was not about progress. It was about endurance. Daily life for our ancestors followed a brutal rhythm. Wake with the sun, search for water, search for food, avoid predators, and hope everyone makes it to nightfall. Repeat endlessly. But out of this relentless cycle came the skills that would later define us. Water always came first. In an Africa stripped of steady rains, knowing where to find reliable springs or seasonal streams was the difference between life and death. Some groups likely learned to track the migrations of animals, following elephants or antelope to hidden waterholes. Others may have developed the ability to read the land itself, noticing a patch of greener grass, a cluster of birds circling overhead, or cracks in the ground that hinted at groundwater below. Archaeologists even suggest that crude wells, simple pits scraped into the earth, might have been dug during this time, just deep enough to sustain a family through the worst of the dry season. Food was harder. Gone were the massive herds of game animals that earlier humans relied on. Instead, Survival meant becoming what scientists call a dietary generalist, eating anything and everything. Insects provided quick protein. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae, roots and tubers, though bitter or even toxic when raw, became staples once cooked over fire. Eggs from bird nests or reptile burrows were precious finds. Occasionally, luck would bring down larger prey, a weakened zebra, an old elephant, or a sick antelope. Every scrap mattered. Nothing was wasted. It was in this crucible that fire revealed its true power. Cooking meat made it safer and released more calories. Boiling or roasting plants neutralized toxins and made tough starches digestible. With fire, humans turned barely edible scraps into sustaining meals. Fire also extended the day. After the sun set, predators prowled, but firelight held them back. In that circle of warmth, people repaired stone tools, sharpened spears, and most importantly, shared knowledge. Because knowledge was survival. In groups of just 20 or 30, everyone's memory mattered. If one person discovered how to detoxify a root, everyone needed to know it. If one hunter spotted a new water source, it had to be shared. Losing a skilled adult wasn't just grief, it was a potential catastrophe, because it could mean the loss of techniques that had taken years to learn. And so, these small bands became relentless teachers. Children grew up absorbing lessons every day: where to dig for tubers, how to track animals, which skies promised rain, how to shape a stone into a cutting edge. Over thousands of generations, this constant transfer of knowledge began shaping the human mind. Bigger brains demanded more energy, but those who could remember, learn, and teach had better chances of survival. Fossils from just after the bottleneck show measurable increases in cranial capacity compared to those before. Natural selection was favoring intelligence, not abstract intelligence yet, but practical, social, survival-focused intelligence. And with intelligence came something even more subtle: the ability to understand one another. Living in tiny groups made conflict dangerous. One quarrel could fracture a community beyond repair. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was instinct. Slowly, under the pressure of survival, our ancestors began refining what psychologists now call theory of mind. The awareness that others think, feel, and intend differently than you do. It is the seed of empathy, of negotiation, of trust. And it may have been the most important adaptation of all. By now, you can see how survival during the bottleneck wasn't just physical, it was social. Each person mattered. Each skill, each fragment of knowledge, each pair of hands could mean the difference between a group enduring or collapsing. Small family bands of perhaps 20 or 30 individuals formed the core of humanity's fragile existence. But they could not stay isolated forever. For the lineage to persist, these scattered groups had to remain connected, however tenuously, across vast landscapes. Scientists call this a metapopulation structure. Clusters of small, vulnerable groups, rising and falling, some disappearing entirely, others hanging on long enough to share genes and knowledge with their neighbors. It's like sparks across a dark landscape. One spark fades, another flickers, but as long as enough survive, the fire does not die. In this way, the estimated 1,280 breeding individuals weren't huddled in a single valley. They were scattered, spread thin across Africa, bound together by kinship ties, trade of stone or shells, or even temporary gatherings where families exchanged both partners and stories. These connections mattered for more than survival. They slowed the collapse of genetic diversity, reducing the dangers of inbreeding. They allowed useful innovations, new tools, better hunting strategies, techniques for finding water, to ripple outward beyond a single band. Even then, the archaeological record hints at cultural convergence, tools of similar design appearing in regions far apart, suggesting that ideas spread faster than genes. Imagine two groups separated by hundreds of miles, chipping stone in the same way. That consistency whispers of contact, of shared learning, of the beginnings of what we could call culture. Meanwhile, the pressure of life shaped the brain in very specific ways. Intelligence was not only about making sharper tools, it was about understanding others. When resources were scarce, selfishness could destroy a group. Sharing, resolving disputes peacefully, caring for the sick and injured. All these became survival strategies. Over thousands of years, our ancestors refined social intelligence. They grew better at reading faces, predicting behavior, knowing when to trust and when to hold back. This refinement was natural selection at work, sculpting minds attuned to cooperation. At night, around the fire, these skills blossomed. Firelight created more than warmth. It carved out time. Without it, night belonged to predators. With it, humans could sit awake, watching sparks rise into the sky, while elders taught children how to track an animal, how to read the clouds, how to prepare a route. These moments, shared stories, warnings, even jokes, were seeds of oral tradition. Knowledge became not just practical, but memorable, wrapped in rhythm and repetition, easier for a child to recall. The first steps toward language may have deepened here, shaped by necessity. Think about what that means. For over 100,000 years, tiny groups of humans were forced to live in a world where survival depended less on muscle and more on memory, cooperation, and teaching. Every generation that survived carried forward not only their genes, but also the skills and lessons of the last. The survivors were not simply the strongest, but the most adaptable, the most social, the most willing to share. The flame of humanity was dim, but it never went out. As the millennia dragged on, something remarkable stirred within those tiny bands of survivors. Their lives were still precarious. One failed season could end a lineage, but generation by generation, the pressure cooker of survival was reshaping them. For over 117,000 years, natural selection operated not gently, but fiercely, rewarding even the slightest edge in cooperation, adaptability, and innovation. This is why many scientists describe the bottleneck as a crucible. Traits that might have taken millions of years to spread in large, stable populations could race through a small one in just a handful of generations. If someone discovered a new way to crack open a nut or prepare a poisonous tuber safely, that knowledge and the genes that supported sharper problem-solving could sweep through the group quickly. Individuals who could cooperate better, who could calm disputes, who could teach children more effectively, gave their families a survival advantage. And when survival is everything, even subtle advantages leave a mark. One of the most extraordinary genetic marks from this period is the fusion of two chromosomes. Humans today have 46 chromosomes, while chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans have 48. At some point during the bottleneck, two ancestral chromosomes merged into what is now known as chromosome 2. Scientists can still see the scar in our DNA, the exact site where two ends fused. It is evidence of a random accident that became universal. Normally, such a mutation would be lost or remain rare. But in a population of only about 1,280 breeding individuals, a change like this could spread through everyone within a few thousand years. Today, every human on Earth carries that fused chromosome. Think about that. In the middle of near extinction, A rare genetic event not only survived, but became part of every one of us. Some researchers even suggest that genes near the fusion site influence neural development, hinting that this accident may have nudged our brains toward greater complexity. Meanwhile, archaeological traces show that tool-making was quietly evolving. Stone implements became more standardized. Instead of haphazard flakes, people were crafting shapes with intention, scrapers, points, cutting edges, all reflecting planning and teaching. This pattern suggests communication was becoming richer. Perhaps not language as we know it, but a system of gestures, sounds, and shared meanings detailed enough to pass on skills with accuracy. The fusion of chromosomes and the sharpening of minds tell the same story. When survival hinges on a few hundred souls, unusual things can become universal. The strange becomes normal. The rare becomes common. Humanity itself was being rewritten in real time. Close your eyes and picture it. A child born in a drought-stricken valley, carrying a fused chromosome that none of their ancestors had. That child grows, survives, and has children of their own. Over generations, that small quirk becomes the signature of an entire species. Today, 8 billion humans share it. A molecular time capsule linking us back to the moment when life should have ended, but instead began again. The genetic evidence of that near extinction isn't just a curiosity locked away in labs. It lives in each of us. Every human alive today carries within their DNA the fingerprints of survival from that bottleneck. Patterns of low genetic variation, the fused chromosome, the traces of traits honed under pressure, all of them whisper of 117,000 years when our species clung to existence by its fingertips. For decades, researchers knew something strange was hidden in our genomes. Early methods of analysis hinted at a collapse, but the signals were faint, like trying to read a book through a keyhole. It wasn't until the development of powerful computational tools, like the Fit-Cole model, that the story came into sharp focus. Suddenly, scientists could look back nearly 1 million years and watch population sizes rise and fall through time. The picture that emerged in 2023 was shocking. Humanity had almost ended before it truly began. And yet, the fossil record mirrors the genetic story. Between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, archaeologists speak of a fossil gap. Few remains of human ancestors exist from this time. For years, it puzzled experts. Was it bad luck, a quirk of geology, or simply that we hadn't dug in the right places? Now the answer seems clear. There were so few humans alive that the odds of any leaving fossils, and of those fossils being preserved and discovered, were vanishingly small. The silence of the Earth reflects the silence of the genes. What makes this survival story even more astonishing is not only that we endured, but how long we endured. Population crashes in other species often last only a few generations. A volcanic eruption, a disease outbreak, a harsh winter, these might thin numbers, but recovery follows quickly. Our ancestors, in contrast, stayed small for more than 100,000 years. Entire species can rise and vanish in less time. That our fragile bands held on for so long is almost without parallel in evolutionary history. How did they do it? Scientists speculate about a refuge, somewhere in Africa where conditions remained just stable enough to support life. Maybe a rift valley that caught rains while the rest of the continent dried. Maybe river corridors that flowed even in drought. Maybe lakes that never vanished completely, drawing both animals and humans to their shores. Within this pocket, life was hard, but it was possible. Perhaps most importantly, during this bottleneck, our ancestors may have learned to master fire more systematically. Archaeological evidence shows an increase in the use of fire around 800,000 years ago, remarkably close to the time when populations began to recover. Fire transformed existence. It made food safer, nights longer, predators hesitant, and cooperation around hearths stronger. It may have been the tool that allowed humanity not just to endure, but to begin preparing for expansion. Imagine the scene. A small band gathered by the flicker of flame, children wide-eyed as sparks drift upward, elders passing on secrets about waterholes, plants, or the movements of animals. Outside that circle, darkness and danger. Inside it, warmth and the fragile continuity of culture. It was here, in those rare enclaves of light, that humanity's second chance was forged. Around 813,000 years ago, something began to change. The climate slowly shifted again. Rains returned more regularly in parts of Africa. Grasslands replaced desert, and animal herds cautiously reappeared. For our ancestors, who had endured tens of thousands of years on the edge of extinction, this change was like a window opening after generations of suffocation. Populations, once trapped in tiny pockets, began to grow. Not slowly, but rapidly. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors spread outward, reclaiming landscapes that had been barren for millennia. This wasn't just recovery, it was transformation. New tools appeared, hand axes and scrapers more carefully shaped than before, designed not only to cut, but to serve specific purposes. Groups became more skilled at hunting, learning to bring down larger animals systematically. Shelters became sturdier, fire more reliably controlled. These innovations weren't random. They were the flowering of traits forged during the bottleneck, adaptability, cooperation, and teaching. Most strikingly, genetic and fossil evidence suggests this period marks the birth of three distinct human lineages. One remained in Africa and eventually gave rise to modern humans, Homo sapiens. Another spread north into Europe and Western Asia, evolving into the Neanderthals. A third moved east into Asia, becoming the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. The bottleneck didn't just squeeze our numbers, it spring-loaded our evolution. When conditions improved, populations didn't simply bounce back. They exploded in multiple directions at once, adapting to new environments with startling speed. Think of it like forcing a river through a narrow canyon for thousands of years. The pressure builds and builds. Then suddenly the canyon widens and the river bursts forth, carving new channels in every direction. That's what happened to humanity. The Neanderthals, heading into Europe, grew strong and stocky, with large nasal passages adapted for icy air and powerful bodies for hunting in frozen landscapes. The Denisovans spread across Asia, leaving traces of their DNA from Siberia to Indonesia, adapting even to high-altitude plateaus like Tibet. Modern human ancestors remaining in Africa honed adaptability above all else, an inheritance from living in a continent that never stopped changing. Yet for all their differences, they were still connected. They shared the fused chromosome, the scars of the bottleneck, and the social and cognitive skills that had been refined during that long trial. They were, in a sense, three branches of the same stubborn tree, each carrying the memory of survival. And with population growth came something else: cultural evolution. Standardized stone tools appeared across wide regions, evidence of communication and teaching spreading faster than genes alone. Networks of exchange may have formed, stone, shells, or pigments traded across distances, binding groups together. This was the faint beginning of something we now recognize as humanity's most powerful advantage: the ability to share ideas beyond bloodlines, to build culture that lasts longer than any single life. The bottleneck had ended. The expansion had begun. And the stage was set for the next great chapters of human history: competition, cooperation, and the mingling of species. As human groups spread outward, the three great branches of our family tree began to take shape. In Africa, the ancestors of modern humans kept refining adaptability, shifting diets, changing tools, adjusting to climates that swung from wet to dry and back again. In Europe, the Neanderthals settled into the icy north, growing stocky and strong, with larger brains and bodies built for cold endurance. In Asia, the shadowy Denisovans dispersed widely, some thriving at high altitudes, others mastering islands and seas. Despite their differences, they all carried the same genetic scars of the bottleneck: low diversity, the fused chromosome, and perhaps most importantly, the sharpened instincts for cooperation and teaching. They were not isolated inventions of nature, but siblings shaped by the same crucible. The Neanderthals, with their massive strength, became expert hunters. Fossils show evidence of coordinated tactics, driving animals into traps, wielding hafted spears, and preserving meat in caves chilled by natural ice. Their graves hint at ritual, careful burials, sometimes with tools or flowers, suggesting symbolic thought and perhaps even the stirrings of belief. The Denisovans, though poorly known in the fossil record, left behind genetic gifts. Their DNA persists today in people across Asia and Oceania, including adaptations that help Tibetans breathe at high altitude and Pacific Islanders thrive in coastal environments. Their legacy is proof that they mastered challenges we can barely imagine. Meanwhile, back in Africa, our direct ancestors were evolving something subtler but transformative: behavioral modernity. The capacity for symbolic thinking, flexible problem-solving, and increasingly complex communication. Archaeological hints, standardized stone tools, pigment use, possible engravings, suggest that by this time, the foundations of language and culture were being laid. The same survival skills that had carried them through the bottleneck, knowledge sharing, empathy, cooperation, were expanding into something far richer. Trade networks likely formed between scattered bands, moving shells, stones, or ochre across great distances. These weren't just goods, they were connections, a way to maintain alliances and genetic flow. Social organization deepened. Instead of small, isolated families, groups began linking into larger communities, with rules about marriage and exchange, practices that helped stabilize populations and prevent dangerous inbreeding. Anthropologists believe this period marks the dawn of structured kinship systems, the first faint outlines of society. And with society came the need for better communication. The spread of standardized tools and shared cultural practices strongly suggests that language, not just sounds and gestures, but increasingly complex verbal systems, was emerging. Language may not fossilize, but its shadow appears in the speed and scale of cultural change. For groups scattered across vast landscapes, the ability to speak and teach with precision could mean survival. Those who communicated clearly lived. Those who did not faded into silence. By 800,000 years ago, humanity was no longer a fragile spark barely clinging to existence. It had become three great flames, each illuminating its own path across continents. But three flames cannot burn in isolation forever. Eventually, they would meet, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as kin, and the choices made in those encounters would decide the fate of all humankind. Fast forward to about 60,000 years ago. By then, our African ancestors, true Homo sapiens, had fully emerged from the long bottleneck. Their populations had grown large enough to push beyond Africa, carrying with them all the traits forged in crisis: adaptability, cooperation, and the capacity for innovation. As they moved into the Middle East, they encountered their long-lost cousins, the Neanderthals of Europe and the Denisovans of Asia. What followed was not a simple story of conquest or replacement. It was a story of contact and exchange. Fossils and DNA prove that modern humans interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans multiple times. Today, every non-African carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA, while populations in Asia and Oceania hold traces of Denisovan ancestry, sometimes as much as 6%. These genetic echoes mean that our survival was never just about us. It was about blending, learning, and absorbing the strengths of others. And yet, modern humans had a decisive edge. Tools became more advanced: spear throwers that could kill from a distance, bone needles for fitted clothing, nets and hooks for fishing, and blades struck from stone cores with surgical precision. These technologies allowed smaller groups to achieve what had once required many, granting efficiency and flexibility. Cultural innovations, art, ritual, symbolic expression blossomed too. Caves filled with paintings, bodies adorned with beads, stories told in firelight. The survival skills honed during the bottleneck now flowered into creativity. For Neanderthals and Denisovans, life grew harder. Neanderthals had mastered cold Europe but were specialists, powerful hunters of big game in a rigid ecosystem. Denisovans had spread far but were fewer in number, leaving only faint traces. In contrast, modern humans thrived because they were generalists, able to eat anything, adapt to any climate, and cooperate in larger, more complex groups. When climates shifted, Neanderthals struggled. When resources grew scarce, Denisovans dwindled. Modern humans adapted, changed strategies, and endured. By 40,000 years ago, the balance tipped. Neanderthal populations shrank to isolated pockets, their last stand in Iberia ending about 28,000 years ago. Denisovans likely held on longer in parts of Asia, perhaps until 25,000 years ago, but they too vanished as distinct groups. In the end, only Homo sapiens remained, carrying fragments of both cousins in their DNA, but also carrying the stubborn adaptability that the bottleneck had instilled. And that brings us back to today. 8 billion humans, spread across every continent, connected by satellites and fiber optic cables, building machines that reach beyond Earth itself. It is almost impossible to reconcile this abundance with the fragility of our origins. We are here only because 1,280 individuals refused to give up, because they found water when rivers dried, because they shared fire when darkness fell, because they taught their children when forgetting could mean death. Every time you cooperate with strangers, every time you teach, every time you adapt to change, you are echoing them. Their resilience is alive in you. The bottleneck is over. The expansion continues. And the story of those survivors, those 1,280 souls, remains the most extraordinary reminder of what it means to be human. Close your eyes. The story is over, but the silence of history remains.